Hello, you are on Ruslan Bailov's channel. Today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine as of August 12, 2025. A tremendous number of events have occurred today, so let's dive in. As usual, we'll start with the hottest and most critical direction, the Pokrovsk direction, where, based on the news from today, yesterday and the day before, we can unequivocally conclude that the Ukrainian armed forces' UAF defenses in this sector have collapsed. The front has crumbled. The Ukrainian side is likely experiencing its most severe crisis since the start of the special military operation. The front line is failing to withstand the Russian army's offensive, and according to updates published mainly by pro-Russian experts, the pace of the advance and the amount of territory captured daily are no longer increasing in arithmetic progression, but rather in something resembling geometric progression. The situation for UAF units on this front is critical. For clarity, I suggest we take another look at how the front line has progressed, starting, let's say, from August 8, 2025. That's roughly when a flood of news began to emerge, indicating that the Russian armed forces managed to break through the front line. On August 8, this is what the map of this frontline sector looked like. We made minor adjustments almost daily, but these were nearly always insignificant. The Russian army was gradually advancing, and nothing suggested that within 4 days, the front line in this sector would collapse, at least not based on open-source data. On August 9th, the first small but significant updates appeared in the northern direction, and the initial warning signs emerged, indicating that Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups were active across almost the entire sector. At the time, no one paid much attention to these reports because no one could have imagined that, relying solely on saboteurs, the Russian army could achieve what is now happening on the front line. On August 10th, the first significant updates appeared, with substantial changes reflected on most mapping services between August 9th and 10. The first notable shifts were in the northern direction. This information was quickly corroborated by pro-Ukrainian cartographers, such as Deep State, though it was primarily disseminated by pro-Russian sources. According to information from August 10th, the Russian army approached Dorozhne, reached Rodinske, cleared Suketska, advanced north toward Novoshakov, and outflanked Volny. By August 10th, the first reports emerged regarding the situation in Zoloty Kolodiaz and Kucherev Yar. On August 11th, pay attention here, the updates from August 10 were followed by additional changes on August 11th, and the cumulative updates by August 11th grew not in arithmetic progression, but by some coefficient, say 1.3. In other words, even more significant updates were made by various cartographers, including pro-Ukrainian mapping services. By the end of August 11th, we can now load all the updates and corrections that occurred on August 12th. Even when talking about August 10th and 11, discussions were split into several possibilities. The Russian army was advancing, and some expected a reaction from Ukraine, perhaps from Syrsky or the UAF. But by August 12th, almost no one is talking about any countermeasures or counteractions from the UAF. This is because confidence in the UAF's ability to resist this breakthrough has been almost entirely lost. It's clear that we're not just seeing progression, but indeed a geometric progression in the advance of Russian units. Moreover, this advance is no longer only being reported by pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian mapping services. Over the past 24 hours, the first geolocations have emerged, confirming advances on the ground in key locations such as Rodinske and Suketske. Now, let's load the events and all the news that have come in from this sector. If we look at all the markers, we see that the overwhelming majority are icons with flags against a red circle, indicating that the Russian army is steadily advancing in all directions. Most likely, this breakthrough became possible after the fall of the settlement of Novoekonomichin, which happened just 2 weeks before these combat operations began. It's safe to say this is the Novoekonomichin flower, blooming in the northern, northwestern, and now northeastern directions. Now let's go through each change over the past 24 hours in order, starting with the eastern part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Reports, mainly from pro-Russian cartographers, indicate that over the past day, Russian units fully cleared the Krasnolimanska mine and approached the settlement of Mirnohrad. Some pro-Russian experts also note that the Russian army has even gained a foothold on the northeastern outskirts of the settlement. not the Komsomolska mine, my apologies. Next, there are reports of Russian units entering the territory of Krasny Lyman and advancing primarily in its northern part, as well as entering the settlement of Rodinsky from the southeast. Here's where things get particularly interesting: objective control footage. In this video, we can see Ukrainian artillery firing on the forward positions of the Russian armed forces on the eastern outskirts of Rodinsky. This objective control footage allows us to conclude unequivocally that Russian army units, through offensive operations or the work of sabotage and reconnaissance groups, have managed to enter the eastern outskirts of Rodinsky, a key settlement critical to the entire northern envelopment of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Furthermore, if the Russian army has indeed secured a foothold in the eastern part of Rodinsky, it likely means they have fully cleared the Krasnolymanska mine, located east of Rodinsky, as well as the Rodinska mine of the same name. These critical strategic points are either completely surrounded with no possibility of evacuation or are already under Russian control. Given the pace of the offensive we're witnessing, I lean toward the conclusion that, at this moment, across this entire territory, in addition to the operations of hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups, there are numerous micro-encirclements, small pockets, strongholds and positions where Ukrainian units are trapped, calling for help and evacuation that under these conditions and at this pace of combat will never arrive. Moving on, today some cartographers and military experts noted further advances by Russian units. First, the outflanking of Rodinsky. As you can see from the updates, Rodinsky is now in a semi-encirclement. Given that we live in the era of FPV drones, the roads in the Rodinsky-Pokrovsk agglomeration are no longer usable. Crossfire leaves no chance for normal evacuation, rotation or maintenance of the UAF garrison. At this rate, in the next few days, the Ukrainian side will either attempt to break out toward the Pokrovsk agglomeration or retreat northwest. However, given the current situation around Pokrovsk, there's a high likelihood that Ukrainian units will attempt a counter-retreat in the northwestern direction, as retreating toward Pokrovsk would essentially mean jumping from one cauldron into another, not the most pleasant outcome in the course of the special military operation. Additionally, small groups of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance units have advanced further west toward the settlement of Novoalexandrivka. Here's where it gets particularly interesting. While no geolocations have yet been published to confirm the presence of Russian units on the outskirts of Novoalexandrivka, it's likely that such evidence will emerge soon, or we'll see additional updates. The significance of this advance lies in the fact that, if confirmed, the distance between the northernmost points of Russian presence, around Novoalexandrivka, and the southernmost points, around Kotlin, is now no more than 10 kilometers. To be precise, according to these updates, the distance is 9,780 meters, roughly 5 kilometers from both the south and the north. This means that the settlement of Hryshine is now under complete, comprehensive, 100% control by FPV drones. This indicates that, as of August 12, 2025, the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration has fallen into an operational encirclement. There is a very high likelihood that, in the near future, a cauldron will close around a significant and powerful contingent of the Ukrainian armed forces in this agglomeration. We're not talking about hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers, we're potentially talking about tens of thousands. Furthermore, today Russian units have become more active in the area of Udakne. The Ukrainian side has released objective control footage showing Ukrainian FPV drone operators striking the central part of the settlement, likely targeting the railway station. There are numerous instances where we can observe strikes on strongholds and temporary deployment positions. Based on this footage, we've made the corresponding updates to the map. Just yesterday, the map of this frontline sector looked like this, with most of Udakne considered under UAF control. Today, there's no doubt that at least 40, if not 50%, of the settlement is under Russian control. This advance and correction indicate that Russian army units have likely received orders to move from Udakne toward Hryshine to shorten the distance for FPV drone operations and to approach the M30 highway closely. It's clear that the Russian army has been ordered to encircle Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk agglomeration as quickly as possible. I wouldn't be surprised if Russian armed forces units managed to achieve this before the meeting between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. This would undoubtedly be a trump card in the hands of the Russian president, one that Ukraine would find very difficult to counter. However, Zelensky is, of course, looking for solutions. Today, news is spreading across the internet that Syrskyi is deploying the 1st Army Corps, the Azov Corps, to Pokrovsk. But let me clarify that we need to clearly and soberly assess what specific tasks these Azov units will actually perform in the context of a defensive or stabilization operation around the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Let me state right away that we will definitely not see assaults or counterattacks from the Azov units. Deploying an entire corps for counterattacks or to cut off Russian advances and salients is something they simply won't do. The 1st Army Corps, those units that, if combat continues, might end up defending Kiev at some point, are not tasked with that. For now, we need to understand that the primary task of the Azov units is likely, based on my reasoning, to create a barrier line, or in simple terms, blocking detachments. According to open-source information, the main issue facing Ukrainian armed forces units is that some territorial defense units or police detachments are abandoning their positions, offering little to no resistance to Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups. The task of the Azov units will likely be to create a kind of dome or barrier line, positioned well behind the current Russian breakthrough line. Their main objective, in simple terms, will be to ensure that no one, whether a Russian saboteur or a Ukrainian territorial defense member, escapes this breakthrough zone alive. They will likely be positioned along something like this yellow line, with the primary goal of stabilizing the front line and forcing those currently stuck in the Pokrovsk area and surrounding settlements to fight, rather than abandon their positions without resisting Russian units. However, these are just assumptions on paper. How these units will actually perform when engaged in combat remains to be seen. I'd also like to remind you that the 1st Army Corps of the Ukrainian Armed Forces was significantly battered in the area of the Kleban Bike Reservoir. We'll return to that sector in about 5 minutes. We have a large number of geolocations from this area, and they are, by the way, all connected to these Azov units, which are now apparently being redeployed to this direction. So we've essentially covered the Pokrovsk agglomeration, its western flank, Udakhna, the north-northeast, and now the northwestern parts. Now let's discuss how the situation is developing further and where Russian units are moving next. We'll start with the southern Kupiansk or Lyman direction, where the Russian army continues its offensive. Over the past 24 hours, several updates have been recorded from various sources, indicating that the Russian army has fully cleared the village of Kolodyazy and significantly improved its positions along the Shandry-Holov-Seredny line, with a large number of households now under Russian control. In the central Kupiansk direction, the Russian armed forces have completely cleared the settlement of Zeleny High. At least, this can be inferred from objective control footage showing 2 Russian soldiers raising the flags of their units, which likely participated in the combat operations in this sector. However, I'd like to highlight one more important point. Despite all these breakthroughs and advances, the Russian Ministry of Defense has been reluctant to officially announce the clearing of specific settlements. This is likely because, on Thursday or Friday, perhaps an hour or two before the meeting with President Trump, the Russian Ministry of Defense will release a substantial list of settlements that have likely already been cleared or will be cleared by Russian units in the next 2 days. Next, we move toward Constantinovka. As we discussed a minute ago, there are a large number of geolocations here, and note where they're coming from. Exactly, Highway 0522, the settlement of Ivanopilia. Virtually all geolocations today are coming from the evacuation or retreat line running from the southeastern part of the Kleban Bike Reservoir toward Konstantinovka. I'd like to remind you that this area was, at one point, and possibly still is, under the responsibility of the 12th Brigade and the Azov units now being redeployed to Pokrovsk. This may explain the large number of geolocations, as the Ukrainian side is currently scraping together everything it can from all frontline sectors to assemble some semblance of a significant force to stabilize the situation around the breakthrough line. This is where everything is being pulled from, and not just from here. In the near future, Ukrainian units will likely retreat from Oleksandro-Shultine, from this pocket, with the focus being on holding the settlement of Konstantinovka itself, at least temporarily, until the situation around Pokrovsk stabilizes. However, looking at how the Russian armed forces offensive is progressing, there's a high likelihood that the Russian army will not assault Constantinovka head-on. Instead, it will likely attempt to semi-encircle the settlement. Moreover, reports are already emerging about another evacuation of nearby settlements located far from the active front line in the Kramatorsk area. Today, the evacuation of the village of Serhivka was announced, a village situated on a potential Russian advance route toward Kramatorsk from the southwest. And that's all, dear friends. Thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel, give your likes, and all the best to you.